He had learned long ago that being early was safer than being late. Traffic delays, people making excuses, he disliked all of it. So that morning he left his city apartment earlier than planned and drove himself instead of using a driver. He wanted quiet. He wanted time to think. The meeting was important. Not the kind that made headlines, but the kind that decided where money would flow next. He had built his fortune by trusting numbers, patterns, and people who delivered results. This meeting was supposed to be simple. Sign papers. Shake hands. Leave. The location, however, was strange. It was not a tall glass building or a polished office space. It was a modest structure on the edge of the city, near a row of old warehouses and closed shops. The road leading there was uneven, with broken sidewalks and faded signs. He slowed the car and checked the address again. It was correct. He parked across the street and looked at the building. From the outside, it looked quiet. Too quiet. No company name. No clear sign. Just a metal door and a few small windows covered from the inside. He checked his watch. He was almost 40 minutes early. Normally, he would have stayed in the car. But something about the place made him uneasy. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the feeling that this place didn't belong in the kind of deal he was about to make. He stepped out of the car and adjusted his jacket. The air smelled of dust and oil. A truck passed by, loud and careless, then disappeared around the corner. The street returned to stillness. As he walked closer, he heard voices. They were not loud, but they were tense. Angry, maybe. He slowed his steps without thinking. The voices came from the side of the building, near a narrow alley. He told himself it was none of his business. People argue everywhere. But his feet kept moving. He stopped near the corner, staying out of sight. The voices became clearer. One voice sounded older, tired. Another sounded sharp and impatient. A third voice stayed quiet, only speaking now and then. He did not recognize any of them. They were talking about money that caught his attention. Not in a casual way. Not joking. It was the kind of talk that carried fear and pressure. Words like deadline, cut, and no choice floated through the air. He felt a strange discomfort in his chest. This was not the conversation he expected to hear. Near a business meeting tied to his investment, he leaned slightly closer, careful not to make noise. The older voice spoke again, slower this time. It sounded like someone who had said the same words many times before and was tired of repeating them. The words were about people losing work, about families, about promises that were made and then broken. The impatient voice interrupted, saying that emotions didn't matter, that the deal was already set, that no one would notice. The quiet voice finally spoke, soft but firm. It said something that made the millionaire's breath catch. The words suggested that his name had been used. Not directly, but clearly enough. They spoke as if he had already agreed to something you'd never heard of. He felt his stomach tighten. He had spent years building a reputation for being careful, for knowing where every decision led. He did not like surprises, especially not ones that sounded like this. He stepped back slightly, his heart beating faster than before. A part of him wanted to walk away immediately, get back into his car, call off the meeting, protect himself. But another part of him stayed. That part remembered where he came from. He had not always been wealthy. He remembered small rooms, unpaid bills, watching adults whisper at night, thinking children couldn't hear. He remembered how one decision made by someone powerful could change everything for people who had no voice. The voices continued. They talked about timing, about how arriving early or late could change who saw what. Someone laughed softly and said no. One important ever arrived early. That sentence stayed with him. He looked down at his watch again. 30 minutes early now. He realized something uncomfortable. If he had arrived on time, he would have missed this entirely. A door opened somewhere inside the building. Footsteps echoed briefly, then faded. The conversation ended suddenly. Silence returned. He stepped back fully now, pressing himself against the wall. His mind raced. He did not know exactly what was happening, but he knew enough to feel uneasy. This meeting was not just about numbers. There were people involved who would be affected in real ways. A few seconds later, the metal door opened. Two men stepped out, talking quietly. They did not see him. They walked past, heading toward a parked car at the end of the street. He watched them go. He did not follow. He did not confront them. Instead, he stood there, alone, feeling the weight of what he had heard. The building looked the same as before, plain, silent, ordinary, but now it felt different, like it was hiding something. He returned to his car, but did not get inside. He leaned against it, crossing his arms, staring at the building. His reflection in the car window looked calm, but he knew he wasn't. For the first time in a long while, he questioned a decision he had already made. His phone buzzed. A message reminding him of the meeting time. Friendly, professional, normal. Nothing about this felt normal anymore. He wondered how many times this kind of thing happened without anyone noticing. How often deals were made in clean rooms while consequences landed elsewhere. He took a slow breath. He had a choice. He could walk away now. No one would blame him. Or he could go inside and see how deep this went. The early arrival had given him something rare. Knowledge before commitment. He straightened his jacket again, calmer now, but more alert. Whatever was happening inside that building, he was no longer just a visitor. He checked the time one more time. Still early, and for the first time. He understood that arriving early had changed everything. He reached for the door handle. The meeting had not started yet, but the story already had. He had never imagined that arriving early could reveal so much. As he stood by the car, the silence of the street felt heavy. The ordinary building no longer seemed simple. It held secrets he was beginning to understand, though not fully. He knew he could not ignore what he had overheard. Some part of him was already committed. Even before he stepped inside, the first thing he noticed when he pushed the door open was the smell. It was a mix of old paper, dust, and something faintly metallic. His shoes made a soft echo on the hard floor. The room inside was small, dimly lit, with narrow tables and chairs. There were no windows. It felt like a place meant to hide things. He saw 3 people sitting around a table. They looked up for a moment, surprised to see him. He gave them a calm nod and stepped closer. Their eyes narrowed. He knew they had not expected anyone to arrive so early, especially not him. He had to think quickly. Acting carefully was more important than speaking. He did not want to give away that he had heard everything outside. Instead, he smiled politely and asked if the meeting had started yet. One of the men shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The older man cleared his throat and said it would start shortly. The millionaire looked around quietly. There were papers scattered on the table, open folders, and some electronic devices he did not recognize. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but he remembered what he had overheard. He could feel tension in the air. It was not just about business. It was about power and influence, and how one group of people controlled the outcome while others suffered. He took a seat, keeping his expression neutral. He could see their eyes on him, judging him, but he remained calm. Patience was his strength. The quiet voice he had heard outside spoke up again. It belonged to a young woman sitting near the end of the table. She looked nervous, but determined. Her hands were shaking slightly as she adjusted a stack of papers. He noticed a small notebook next to her, filled with notes. The notes were messy, written in different ink colors. She seemed meticulous, but also burdened. He guessed she carried responsibility that was far heavier than anyone should have at her age. The older man, who spoke with authority, leaned forward and began explaining something. His tone was firm but careful. He discussed numbers, timelines, and consequences. The millionaire listened carefully. He understood most of it, but some details were meant to confuse outsiders. They spoke in technical terms, trying to hide the human side of the decisions they were making. As the conversation continued, the young woman suddenly interrupted. Her voice was soft at first but grew stronger. She asked why they were making decisions without considering the people who would be affected. She mentioned families, employees, and others who had no say in the matter. Her words caused a ripple of unease around the table. The older man frowned. He tried to explain that this was business, that emotions could not interfere. The impatient man at the other side of the table muttered something about efficiency and deadlines. But she did not back down. She looked directly at him when she spoke, as if challenging him personally. The millionaire felt a strange connection to her courage. It reminded him of his own early days, when he had fought for small opportunities, when every decision could make or break him. He remembered the fear, the uncertainty, and the small victories that had pushed him forward. He realized that he could not remain a silent observer. Yet, he also knew that revealing his knowledge too soon could be dangerous. He had to be careful, strategic. Timing would matter. His presence alone had already shifted the energy in the room. He decided to ask a question, casually, as if he were just curious. It was about one of the numbers on the table. The older man glanced at him, slightly irritated, but answered. The question was simple, but it gave the millionaire insight into the deeper layers of the situation. He began to piece together how the decisions had been made, why some voices were ignored, and why the young woman was so concerned. The young woman noticed his question and looked at him with curiosity. She did not know who he was or what he had heard outside, but she could feel that he was different from the others. He did not just nod along or accept the explanations. He was thinking, questioning, observing. He realized that his arrival early had given him a unique perspective. No one else in that room had the benefit of the surprise. No one had seen him before he understood the full situation. He could use that to understand the truth, to prepare for a choice that might be necessary later. The older man continued talking, explaining the next steps. They were planning actions that could have serious consequences for many people. The words were not cruel, but they were cold. Business decisions often were, but the millionaire felt a growing sense of responsibility. He could not ignore this. He could not leave until he understood everything. The young woman spoke again, her voice shaking slightly now. She asked if there was no way to change the plan to reduce harm. The impatient man rolled his eyes, muttered something about rules and efficiency. The older man sighed. Trying to regain control of the discussion, the millionaire noticed the subtle signs of fear and hesitation. He could see that the young woman's words had struck a nerve. The other two tried to appear confident, but their actions betrayed them. They were not cruel people by nature, he realized, but they had been trapped in systems that demanded results over compassion. He listened quietly, letting their words reveal the truth. The truth was not simple. It was complicated, tangled with bureaucracy, promises, and self-interest. But he was beginning to see the human cost. He felt it deeply, more than he expected. He remembered the families he had grown up around. Neighbors struggling to pay rent, friends whose parents worked long hours for little money. The faces of people he knew flashed in his mind. He felt a pull, a sense that he could not leave this room without doing something. Even if it was small. The conversation shifted. They began discussing logistics, deadlines, and compliance. The young woman continued to challenge them, asking questions that no one else wanted to answer. The millionaire observed, thinking about how he could help without revealing too much too soon. He needed more information, more understanding before taking action. He realized that the meeting, which he had expected to be brief and simple, had become something much more significant. He was no longer just a participant in a business deal. He was witnessing a human story unfolding, one that required attention, empathy, and careful thought. He leaned back slightly in his chair, pretending to be casual while absorbing every word. He began to connect pieces he had not noticed before. The small details, the hesitations, the pauses. The way people avoided eye contact, they all revealed more than the words themselves. The young woman glanced at him again, sensing his presence, his attention. She was still cautious, but seemed slightly reassured that someone else noticed the truth. He gave a subtle nod, silent acknowledgement of her courage. Time passed, though it felt both fast and slow. The discussion grew more tense. He realized that he had been there longer than he expected, and yet he was learning more in this quiet room than he ever could have anticipated. He understood the stakes now. He saw the potential outcomes, the risks, the damage, and the small opportunities to make a difference. The early arrival had put him in a position to understand before taking any step, See before being seen. The conversation wound down temporarily. People stood up, stretched, and adjusted papers. The young woman gathered her notebook, carefully stacking the pages. The older man made some notes on a sheet of paper, and the impatient man checked his watch. The millionaire remained seated, calm, thoughtful. He knew that the real challenge was still ahead. He had to decide how to act, when to speak, and what to reveal. But he also knew he had the advantage of insight that only early arrival had granted him. He took a deep breath and prepared for the next phase. The next steps would be delicate, requiring both courage and strategy, but he felt ready. He had learned to observe, to wait, and to understand before acting, and for the first time that morning, he felt the weight of responsibility not as a burden, but as a guide. The meeting had not yet begun, and yet everything had already changed. The room had grown quieter. The earlier tension had shifted into a heavy, thoughtful silence. The millionaire stayed seated, observing carefully. Every glance, every movement, and every quiet breath carried meaning. He realized that this moment was more than a simple meeting. It was a revelation of human nature, of decisions made in shadows, and of the unseen consequences that touched countless lives. The young woman, sensing the weight in the room, leaned forward and spoke with cautious determination. Her voice was steady now, stronger than before. She asked questions that no one seemed ready to answer. How could they justify actions that would hurt innocent people? Why did the rules seem more important than compassion? Were the benefits truly worth the cost? The older man, who had been quiet for a few minutes, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but carried the weariness of someone who had seen too much. He explained that decisions had to be made quickly, that compromises were necessary, and that no system could please everyone. His words were logical, precise, and calculated, but they felt hollow. The millionaire could sense the conflict in his tone. Deep down, he knew the older man wrestled with the same doubts, but had chosen the path of convenience and efficiency. The impatient man, however, showed frustration. He spoke quickly, trying to dismiss the questions as unnecessary obstacles. He believed the rules were absolute, and that any delay or hesitation would cost money, influence, and time. But even he could not fully hide the tension in his shoulders and the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The millionaire felt an unfamiliar heaviness. He had faced challenges in his life, tough choices, and risks that could have destroyed him. But this was different. This was not just about him or his company. This was about real people, people who had no power to fight back. He had a fleeting thought of the young woman outside of the families, of children who would feel the results of decisions made in this quiet room. His sense of responsibility grew quietly but insistently. He leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully. He realized that every small observation he had made since arriving early added a layer to the bigger picture. The voices, the tension, the unsaid words, they were all pieces of a puzzle. He could now see patterns, the hidden motivations, and the subtle signs of fear, doubt, and quiet resistance. He noticed how the young woman shifted papers, arranging her notes meticulously. She paused often, reading, thinking, and jotting down new observations. Her focus was sharp, and he could see that she cared more about people than the numbers in front of her. Her determination reminded him of his younger self, the times he had fought for what he believed was right. Even when the world told him it was impossible, the millionaire decided to speak, but cautiously. He asked a simple question about the timeline. Nothing dramatic, just enough to understand how fast decisions were expected to be executed. The older man responded with precise details, explaining the deadlines and what was expected from each person. But the young woman's eyes lit up with a subtle hope. She seemed relieved that someone else was listening, that someone else cared enough to understand. The conversation shifted naturally. The young woman spoke again, her words gentle yet pointed. She asked if there was no way to reconsider, to find alternatives that would lessen harm. She spoke not to argue, but to find solutions. Her sincerity made the millionaire notice something critical. He had the opportunity to influence the discussion without making anyone feel attacked. He decided to wait and observe. The room was small, and the air felt thick with unspoken tension. Every decision here could ripple outward, affecting lives beyond the walls. The millionaire felt the growing weight of these choices pressing against him. His mind raced through possibilities. How could he help without forcing change that might backfire? How could he steer the situation toward fairness without endangering the fragile balance? He watched the older man as he responded. His words were calm, but there were tiny cracks in his voice, small hints of internal conflict. The impatient man shifted in his seat, clearly irritated by the discussion. The young woman's persistence created subtle changes in their expressions, the kind that only someone paying close attention could notice. These small details were valuable, and the millionaire knew it. A brief silence fell across the table. Everyone was processing. The millionaire realized that he could not remain passive much longer. His presence alone had already altered the energy in the room. He understood that if he waited too long, he might lose the chance to make a meaningful difference. But rushing in with authority or confrontation would be counterproductive. Strategy and patience would be his greatest tools. He continued to ask small, careful questions, each designed to gain insight and guide the discussion subtly. The older man answered politely but cautiously, aware that his decisions were being scrutinized. The impatient man tried to dismiss him, but he remained calm, persistent, and thoughtful. The young woman seemed relieved that someone else noticed the truth and was willing to understand the situation fully. Time passed, and the room's tension shifted again. The young woman spoke passionately about human cost, about the moral responsibilities often ignored in pursuit of profit. She described scenarios that could impact families, communities, and individuals who had no voice in these decisions. The millionaire listened intently, weighing each point. Understanding the full scope of the consequences, he realized that this meeting was not just about business, it was about justice. Small injustices often passed unnoticed. And this room was a microcosm of larger systems where decisions were made without human consideration. He felt a sense of urgency, not for himself, but for those whose lives hung in the balance. His wealth, power, and knowledge could influence outcomes here, but it had to be done carefully. The conversation continued to flow. He observed the subtle interactions, the tone of voice, and body language. The young woman's courage was evident, but so was the risk she took by speaking out. The older man's careful explanations hinted at moral conflict, and the impatient man's irritation masked an awareness that he could not fully dismiss these concerns. He understood that the room held more than facts and figures. It held emotions, human struggle, and moral tension. The millionaire could sense the invisible threads connecting each person to the consequences of their choices. He recognized the delicate balance between action and restraint, influence and respect. He realized that he had arrived at a critical juncture where knowledge alone was not enough. Action had to be measured, precise, and compassionate. The young woman paused, taking a deep breath, and spoke again, highlighting potential solutions that were fairer and more humane. She outlined alternatives that could reduce harm while still achieving necessary goals. The older man listened, nodding occasionally, but he did not respond immediately. The impatient man leaned back, skeptical but attentive. The millionaire sensed an opportunity. He could guide the discussion without revealing his prior knowledge. He asked clarifying questions, subtly framing points that allowed the young woman's ideas to be considered seriously. His calm demeanor and thoughtful inquiries created space for reflection, something the others seemed to need but were unwilling to initiate on their own. Minutes passed like hours. Every word, every gesture, every silence carried weight. The room had transformed from a tense negotiation to a delicate exploration of consequences and responsibility. The millionaire realized that his early arrival had given him an unparalleled vantage point, allowing him to understand the situation fully before making a decision or revealing his insights. As the meeting continued, he observed subtle shifts. The older man's posture relaxed slightly. The impatient man's expression softened, and the young woman's confidence grew. He recognized that change was possible, even within the constraints of rules and deadlines. Compassion and reason could coexist with efficiency if approached thoughtfully. He leaned forward, quietly reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The streets, the early arrival, the overheard conversation all had led to this moment. He felt a deep responsibility, not just to the people in the room, but to those beyond it who would be affected by the decisions made here. The conversation slowed. People paused, considering each point carefully. The millionaire knew that the real work had only begun. Observing was not enough. Understanding was essential, but action would ultimately define the outcome. He remained patient, knowing that the next step required wisdom, courage, and precise timing. The young woman finally closed her notebook and looked around the table. Her eyes met his for a brief moment. There was a silent acknowledgement, a recognition that someone else understood, someone else cared. It was a small gesture, but powerful. He nodded subtly, conveying reassurance and shared purpose. He knew that the story unfolding here was larger than any single decision or person. It was a story of human responsibility, moral courage, and the delicate balance between power and compassion. He realized that arriving early had allowed him to witness the truth, to understand before acting, and to prepare for the crucial choices that would follow. The meeting had not concluded, but a quiet transformation had occurred. The millionaire felt a renewed sense of purpose. He understood that his role was no longer passive. He would need to guide, influence, and act, all while maintaining careful observation and respect for the others in the room. As he leaned back, breathing slowly, he realized that arriving early had given him more than insight, had given him a responsibility he could not ignore. The room, the people, and the choices before him were now intertwined with his own values, his own past, and his own commitment to fairness. And in that quiet, dimly lit room, he understood that the truth was not just what he had overheard or observed, but what he would do with that knowledge. The real test, he knew, was still ahead. The room felt heavier as the discussion continued. The millionaire stayed calm, quietly taking in every detail. He had come early, and that early arrival had allowed him to understand more than anyone else in the room. Every word, every glance, every hesitation carried meaning. He realized that now his role was shifting. Observation alone was no longer enough. He had to find a way to act, but carefully. The young woman spoke again, presenting her ideas with careful thought. She outlined alternatives that could lessen harm without compromising the essential goals. Her voice carried sincerity, determination, and hope. She had clearly thought through every consequence, every possible outcome. The millionaire admired her courage. He knew that without someone speaking up, the decisions being made could go unchecked. The older man listened, nodding occasionally, but his tone was measured. He still defended the rules, the deadlines, and the decisions that had been made before. Yet the cracks in his resolve were visible. The millionaire could see hesitation in the way he shifted in his chair, in the slight pauses before answering questions. He was not a cruel man, just someone trapped in systems that valued efficiency over empathy. The impatient man grew restless. He tapped his fingers, checked his watch, and muttered under his breath. He wanted the meeting to be over, the plans to be executed, and the results to be achieved. But even he could not ignore the logic and humanity in the young woman's words, nor the calm and insightful presence of the millionaire who had asked thoughtful questions throughout. The millionaire leaned forward, speaking softly but deliberately. He asked questions that seemed simple on the surface, but were designed to clarify impacts and uncover hidden effects of the proposed plans. The questions were strategic, but they carried a tone of concern. He did not want to confront anyone directly yet. Instead, he wanted to guide the conversation in a direction that would allow better decisions to emerge. The older man responded cautiously, clearly aware that the room had changed since the millionaire had arrived. He could feel the shift in energy, the subtle influence of someone who was paying attention, questioning, and understanding. The impatient man grew quieter, less dismissive. Realizing that he could not simply push decisions forward without considering the insights that were emerging, the young woman spoke again, and this time she referenced a specific scenario. She described how the proposed actions could impact real people, families struggling to make ends meet, Employees depending on stability, and individuals whose lives could be disrupted permanently. Her words were carefully chosen, emotional yet grounded in facts. The millionaire felt a pang of recognition. He remembered similar struggles from his own past. When small decisions by powerful people had affected the lives of ordinary people he cared about, he saw an opportunity. He asked a question that gently encouraged the others to consider these human impacts more seriously. He framed it in a way that allowed the young woman's ideas to gain credibility, without threatening the authority of the older man or provoking the impatient man. It was a delicate balance. He handled it with patience and thoughtfulness. As the conversation progressed, subtle changes became visible. The older man leaned back slightly, considering new possibilities. The impatient man's expression softened, though he still maintained a cautious posture. The young woman's confidence grew, encouraged by the subtle validation from someone who clearly understood the complexity of the situation. The millionaire realized that early arrival had given him more than insight. It had given him leverage, not through power or force, but through understanding. He knew more than anyone else in the room about the unseen impacts, the human stories behind the numbers. He could guide the discussion without imposing, allowing solutions to emerge that were fair, compassionate, practical. He continued to ask careful questions, listen, and reflect. The conversation became more focused on outcomes that could minimize harm while still achieving essential goals. He noticed small gestures, the older man nodding slightly, the impatient man shifting in his seat, the young woman's eyes brightening with hope. These were signs that the direction of the meeting was changing. Time passed. The air in the room, once heavy with tension, began to feel lighter, more thoughtful. The millionaire observed every interaction, every pause, every glance. He understood that the human side of business decisions could not be ignored. Compassion was not weakness. It was insight. And insight was power. He reflected on how arriving early had transformed the morning. Had he arrived on time, he would have missed the initial conversations, the overheard words that revealed the truth. He would have walked in without understanding the full context, without the knowledge that gave him the ability to influence outcomes carefully and responsibly. Now, he saw the bigger picture. The meeting was no longer just about rules, deadlines, and numbers. It was about human impact, ethical responsibility, and moral courage. He felt a deep sense of duty to ensure that decisions considered these factors, not out of fear or obligation, but because it was the right thing to do. The young woman summarized her points once more, emphasizing fairness, accountability, and care for those affected. The older man nodded thoughtfully, clearly processing her words. The impatient man remained cautious, but his body language suggested he was starting to listen more intently. The millionaire decided to contribute more actively, sharing observations without revealing too much of what he had overheard outside. He framed his insights as questions, encouraging reflection and discussion rather than confrontation. His approach allowed the others to consider alternatives and see the human side of the decisions in a new light. As the meeting continued, subtle shifts occurred. The older man began to explore compromises he had not considered before. The impatient man suggested small adjustments to plans, carefully testing the waters of this new approach. The young woman grew more confident, feeling supported rather than alone in advocating for better solutions. The millionaire realized that influence is not about dominating the conversation, but about guiding it gently, strategically, and compassionately. He could see that his presence had changed the trajectory of the meeting, not through force, but through understanding, patience, and careful observation. He felt a growing sense of responsibility. The people in the room, the lives affected, the decisions being made, all of it mattered deeply. He understood that arriving early had not just given him knowledge, but also a duty to act thoughtfully, to ensure that outcomes would be humane and just. As the discussion wound down, the atmosphere had transformed. The tension remained, but it was now paired with consideration, reflection, and hope. The young woman had been heard. The older man had begun to see alternatives. Even the impatient man had adjusted his approach. Recognizing the importance of careful thought alongside efficiency, the millionaire took a deep breath. Feeling the weight of what had been achieved and what still needed to be done, Early arrival had given him insight, but it had also given him a moral responsibility he could not ignore. He knew that the next steps would require courage, strategy, and patience. He also knew that the decisions made in this room would ripple far beyond its walls. He leaned back, silently acknowledging the young woman's determination and courage. Her willingness to speak up had been the catalyst for change. He realized that people like her were rare, and they needed support, understanding, and allies to ensure their voices could be heard. The meeting was far from over, but a quiet transformation had taken place. The energy in the room had shifted from tension to thoughtful consideration. The millionaire understood that arriving early had not just revealed hidden truths, it had created an opportunity to guide decisions toward fairness and compassion. He felt a renewed sense of purpose. His role was no longer passive observation. It was active engagement, using knowledge, patience, and empathy to influence outcomes. He understood that the choices made here would impact real people, and he was determined to ensure those choices were responsible and humane as he prepared for the next phase of the discussion. He reflected on the power of early arrival, the value of observation, and the importance of moral courage. The room, the people, and the unfolding decisions were now intertwined with his own values and sense of responsibility. He took a slow, steady breath. The path ahead would be challenging, but he felt ready. He had seen the truth, understood its implications, and was prepared to act thoughtfully. The meeting would continue, but he knew that the most important changes had already begun. The room had changed in ways no one could fully articulate. The tension that had weighed on everyone had softened into quiet reflection. The young woman had spoken courageously, the older man had begun to reconsider his assumptions, and even the impatient man had adjusted his approach. The millionaire, who had arrived early and witnessed the truth before anyone else, now understood that this was the moment where careful thought had to transform into deliberate action. He leaned forward, gently guiding the conversation. His questions and observations had already influenced the room, helping people see the consequences of their choices more clearly. He knew that he could not impose his perspective, but he could encourage reflection, and that alone could be powerful. He asked about specific outcomes, about people who would be directly affected, and about steps that could minimize harm. Each question was simple, but it made the others think deeply. The young woman smiled faintly at him, a quiet acknowledgement of shared understanding. She had found an ally, even if he had not yet revealed the depth of his knowledge. The older man, too, seemed to shift in his thinking, recognizing that human impact mattered as much as deadlines and profits. The impatient man, though still careful, had begun to listen more intently, realizing that efficiency alone could not justify harm. They discussed alternatives, brainstorming ways to achieve goals without causing unnecessary damage. Each idea was weighed carefully, considering both practical and ethical consequences. The room became a space of thoughtful collaboration rather than conflict. The millionaire observed every gesture, every word, every pause. He could see the gradual transformation of perspectives, and it gave him hope. He thought about his own journey. He remembered the struggles of his early life, the moments when small acts of kindness or understanding had made a difference. He realized that his wealth and experience gave him the ability to guide decisions now, not through authority, but through insight and careful influence. He understood that leadership was not just about power, about responsibility. The young woman presented a plan that considered both human and practical needs. It was clear, thoughtful, and compassionate. The older man nodded slowly, recognizing the merit of her approach. The impatient man, though initially skeptical, began to see the value in balancing efficiency with humanity. The millionaire smiled quietly, knowing that change was possible when people were encouraged to see the bigger picture. Time passed, and the discussion deepened. They analyzed potential risks, explored alternatives, and considered long-term consequences. The millionaire remained attentive, offering subtle guidance through questions and reflections rather than directives. He understood that true influence came from understanding and collaboration, not dominance or force. At one point, the older man spoke with a tone of quiet admission. He acknowledged that he had not considered certain impacts fully, and that the young woman's insights were valuable. The impatient man admitted that he had focused too narrowly on deadlines and efficiency, overlooking human factors. The young woman, encouraged by these acknowledgments, continued to offer solutions that balanced fairness and practicality. The millionaire felt a sense of satisfaction. Not pride, but the deep fulfillment that comes from seeing thoughtful change unfold. He knew that arriving early had given him the chance to witness the truth, to understand the dynamics, and to influence the outcome positively. Without that early arrival, the conversation might have been rushed. Decisions might have been made without reflection, and real people could have suffered unnecessarily. As the meeting drew to a close, the room felt lighter. The energy had shifted from tension to resolution. The young woman gathered her notes. The older man finalized decisions with a more considered approach, and the impatient man agreed to adjustments that balanced efficiency with empathy. The millionaire leaned back, reflecting on the transformation he had witnessed and quietly facilitated. He realized that influence was subtle. It was not about asserting control, but about guiding others to see possibilities they might have overlooked. It was about patience, observation, and careful timing. He had arrived early and seen what others did not, and that knowledge had allowed him to help steer the conversation toward fairness and compassion. The young woman looked at him, her eyes conveying gratitude and recognition. She did not know the full extent of what he had overheard or observed, but she understood that his presence had mattered. The older man nodded slightly, acknowledging the value of reflection and careful consideration. The impatient man, though still cautious, had begun to accept that thoughtful analysis could complement speed and efficiency. The meeting ended, and the people began to leave. The millionaire stayed for a moment, letting the room settle. He felt the weight of the decisions, but also the hope that they had been guided toward better outcomes. He understood that the real impact would be felt later in the lives of people who might never know the decisions that had been made on their behalf. As he walked out into the quiet street, he reflected on the morning. The early arrival, the overheard conversation, the careful observation, and the subtle guidance had all contributed to a transformation. He realized that true power was not in wealth or position, but in understanding, patience, and the ability to influence with integrity. He walked to his car, feeling a deep sense of purpose. The decisions made in that room would ripple outward, affecting lives in ways that might never be fully visible. Yet he knew that he had acted responsibly, thoughtfully, and with compassion. The young woman's courage, combined with his guidance, had created a positive change. He started the car, taking a slow breath, and looked back at the building one last time. It appeared ordinary from the outside, but he knew the truth. Inside, a quiet transformation had occurred. People had been challenged to think beyond their own convenience and consider the human impact of their choices. It was a small victory, but an important one, as he drove away. He thought about the importance of noticing, of arriving early, and of paying attention to details that others might overlook. He realized that opportunities to make a difference often came in small, unexpected moments, and it was in those moments that true character, true leadership, and true humanity were revealed. He felt a sense of calm determination. The morning had started like any other, with plans, schedules, and expectations. Yet it had unfolded into something much greater, a story of awareness, courage, and responsibility. He knew that the experience would stay with him, shaping his future decisions and reminding him that knowledge without action was wasted, and action without consideration could be harmful. The streets were quiet as he drove through the city. He thought about the people affected by the decisions in the room and hoped that they would find stability and relief. He felt a deep sense of connection to them, even though he had never met them. He understood that decisions in business and life were rarely isolated. They rippled outward, touching lives in ways that were both visible and invisible. The millionaire arrived at his office later in the day, reflecting on the lessons he had learned. He knew that arriving early, observing carefully, and acting with empathy had made a real difference. He understood that leadership was not just about making decisions, but about guiding others to make decisions that were fair, humane, and thoughtful. He looked at his watch and smiled quietly. The meeting had ended hours ago, but the impact would continue to unfold. He realized that life often presented opportunities to influence outcomes for the better, sometimes in subtle, quiet ways. And it was in those moments that true responsibility and true humanity were tested. As the sun set over the city, he felt a sense of fulfillment. The young woman's courage, the older man's willingness to reconsider, and even the impatient man's gradual openness had combined to create change. And he had played a role not through force or authority, but through understanding, observation, and thoughtful engagement. He knew that the morning would stay with him. A reminder that arriving early, paying attention, and acting with integrity could alter the course of events. It was a lesson he would carry forward, both in business and in life, knowing that the choices made in small, quiet moments could have profound and lasting effects. And with that thought, he closed his eyes briefly, took a deep breath, and continued his journey, aware that the world was full of unseen stories, waiting for someone to arrive early, notice, and act with care.